Right, what I wanted to try and do is basically provide some perspective on Tisha B'Av, and I think that the title of Finding Meaning in Mourning is it's for me the most difficult task, really, most difficult task. And the reason why I say it's the most difficult task is because the notion of mourning, which obviously, God forbid, no one wants to have to undergo, is an emotion. It's an emotional state of mind. And that's very difficult to require people to be in a certain state of mind at a certain time of year, just because it is that time of year, right? And as we'll see, you know, this finds, I think, it finds expression like in a number of different ways. So I began here with a Gemara which basically describes the process of how the rules developed, right? The restrictions that we have on Tisha B'Av, which is really, really fascinating. Firstly, because it's just fascinating to know how it all came about, and it gives you real insights into the dilemmas that people had in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy of the magnitude of the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. It's one of the things which I think is really difficult to understand, because it's so distant. And we read about it in the davening, we know about it kind of intellectually, but you know, one thing I if you have a chance to read, I don't know if you've seen Simon Sebag Montefiori's book on Jerusalem. It came out a few years ago. It was quite like a big book on history of Jerusalem, whatever. It's quite a difficult tome, like if you want to, unless you're into that type of thing. I'm into that type of thing, a lot of people are, right? Is that the first chapter of that book, he basically describes the siege of Jerusalem, and it's absolutely horrific. His guys are based on the historical accounts of what those events were like, what actually went on. You know, I remember one Tisha B'Av a number of years ago. I was so taken by the way he described it, but I actually read out, I can't remember whether it was like before Eicha or maybe it was during the Kiddush or something, like a few paragraphs from that book, just describing like just how horrific, you know, it was, how horrific the situation was. And I say that because you'll see as we see this Gemara that this was like, it was so devastating to everyone that they just almost, the magnitude of how to market was really difficult. And Tisha B'Av had been around before, right? Tisha B'Av had been there from, we know the history of the origin. We'll come back to it maybe later about the spies and everything else. And they came back that night, and that's why they cried forever on the night that the spies returned. So Tisha B'Av had been in existence, but it was really after the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed that they had this real dilemma of how do you cope with something so severe. So I just sort of like maybe go through a bit of this. I might paraphrase some of it as well. It's the first page. So the Gemara says like this: and our rabbis talk. When the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Rabu Prushim B'Yisrael. So there were basically loads of people amongst the Jewish people who decided that they wanted to separate themselves. Porosh means like lifrosh means to separate. They wanted to become totally separate from any pleasures. They didn't want to eat meat or drink wine ever again. Right, not once a year. The tragedy was so great. They said, "We're just going to give up. Basically, we can't. How can we possibly enjoy life anymore after this?" Rabbi Shiur attached himself to them. He said to them, "Bonai, my children, why aren't you eating meat or drinking wine?" They said to him, "We should eat meat that they used to offer on the mizbeach, on the altar, and now isn't there anymore. How can we think of eating meat? Should we drink wine that they used to pour on the mizbeach and is now no longer functioning? It's not possible. You know, you hear in these words. You've got to think about the words in the context then, and try and think about it. And I think sometimes with these Gemaras, the beauty of them is that they translate equally into contemporary terms. So you can imagine people sort of, let's say, after the Holocaust saying the same thing, like, how can we possibly, you know, after what I've seen, how can I possibly go and throw a party? You know, I can't do it. It's not possible. So he said back to them, if so, lechem lo nochal. So let's take it to its extreme. We shouldn't eat any bread, because the meal offerings have ended. So they said, well, efsheba perish, you can have fruit. Peres and no, we can't eat fruit. First fruits, they're also gone, right? We can eat other fruit. We shouldn't drink water because they used to pour the water on the mizbeach and sukkahs. Shotku, they were silent. Now he says to them, first he gives a sort of, he says, if I take your argument to its logical conclusion, you will not be able to eat anything. because everything was involved in some way in the Mizbeach, right? In the Beis Hamikdash. So how can it possibly be? You're going to lose, you won't be able to do anything at all. So then
assuming the meat and wine was just because that's what gives you.
Yeah, that's what you would assume. But he was basically he basically gives them a logical. It's a double-edged sort of response. It's a two-staged response. His first response to them is like a sort of a logical one, and saying, by your logic, if you're going to approach the mourning for the Beis Hamikdash in that way, okay, and you're going to say the way we're going to mourn is by basically saying, well, anything we used to enjoy then we can't enjoy now, then you're going to be left. You're going to get to an absurd, impossible conclusion that you won't be able to live with. So therefore, now he has to give them a way out. He has to give them, okay, so what is the solution? So Omalami said to them in third paragraph, Bonai, my children, I will come and tell you, let me tell you as follows. Not to mourn at all is impossible, because the decree has happened, right? So we have to mourn. We can't mourn too much because we have a basic halachic principle, which is we never decree anything on a community that they cannot cope with. It's a very fascinating principle, appears a number of times in the Gemara, has very interesting ramifications halachically. You can't impose something that just the majority of people are not going to do. They're not going to manage. So therefore, there's no way we can put in a place of rules like never eat meat or wine or drink wine again, which people are just not going to live with. Therefore, and then he brings a passage to support that. We don't have to go into that. So again, the next paragraph, this is what the sages said. Sod Adam es Beiso said, a person should plaster his house normally, and leave over a little bit. For Kama, how much is that? Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Alama. An Amma by an Amma, Amar Rav Chisda Keneged HaPesach, opposite the entrance. So that's the source for leaving a square, right? An Amma by an Amma, where you leave over from your house that's non-plastered in remembrance of the Beis Hamikdash. And he carries on the same theme, okay? He says, similarly, when a person makes a meal, they should leave over something small from it. It's not entirely clear exactly how, whether this is kept in what ways. We don't have to go into that now. What is it? And Rav Papa said it was kasa de harsana, some sort of elegant fish dish or something they used to have. He was sort of saying, you don't make it as you leave something small over so that it's not, there's a recognizable, it's noticeable, right? The third example he gives, I'm just sort of paraphrasing rather than doing one inside.
That's what people should do in general.
Again, I'm not in a practical sense.
I mean, nothing to do with the 9 days.
No. This isn't about the 9 days at all. This is basically about how the remembering the Beis Hamikdash should be like a constant presence. Yeah, that's what I mean.
That went out to the window. People could bring themselves to leave on their plates.
Whether they couldn't bring to leave anything. Yes, and I don't think it means necessarily to leave something on your plate. I think it's more like if you're preparing a major banquet. So the idea would be that there would be one particular dish, something that you wouldn't prepare, almost that's something like that. Exactly. I don't think it means sort of. I think that's what it means. Yeah. Not so to speak to leave it to waste it, but it means you prepare the meal as normal, but you leave over a little bit. And I think this is actually brought down in that's so he said I think they discussed this. So it means I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in a practical halachic sense, but it is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. That person preparing a banquet leaves over something small so that it doesn't prepare something so that it remembers the Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't apply to Shabbos and Yom Tov, for example. Doesn't apply to Shabbos and Yom Tov. So there's a whole thing about. But what I want to get sort of the theme of what he's saying. Similarly, he says the same thing. The next paragraph is basically saying the same thing with Osa Isha Kol Tachshitel. A woman would adorn herself in every way she wishes, but just leave over something very, very small. The Gemara gives an example of what it was, something they used to use in those days. That tiny thing would leave over just as a remembrance of the Beis Hamikdash. This is the theme he's developing. And then the next one he says, what does he mean when he says Al Rosh Simchasi? Right? This is like the fourth paragraph, fifth from the end. What does he mean Al Rosh Simchasi? I place Yerushalayim by the head of my joy, the point of the head of my joy. Omer Rav Yitzchak. So Rav Yitzchak said, that's the minhag of putting ash on the forehead of a chassan, right? this idea is part of the same thing, right? The time of the greatest simcha, you put a little bit of ash on the forehead of the chassan just before the chuppah, and that is widely done, right? In order to, again, there's something there in the simcha that reminds us of Yerushalayim. Exactly. So you see the theme, right? Exactly. The theme. This is where we get the breaking of the glass, the breaking of the plate at the vort. This is exactly the same idea. Particularly at a time of great simcha, there's something that is left out, or something is done to remind us of the of Yerushalayim. Okay. Now, if you just skip the next line. The next line, go to where it says, this is the third paragraph from the end. Tanya, the Bride says, Omer Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha. Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha says, Miyom shecharav Beis Hamikdash, from the time when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, dinu shenigzar al atzmeinu, really, we should decree on ourselves, shelo le'achol basar v'lo l'shtos yain. Really, we should not drink any meat and not drink any wine. As we said before, you can't make a decree on the congregation, on the tzibur, unless they are able to actually cope with it. They have to be able to live with it. And then he says, he says that from the time when the Romans have been attacking us, he lived at the time, I think, of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. They attack us, all these terrible decrees. They make it stop us learning and doing mitzvahs. And they don't allow us to enter. He talks about Shavua Haben or Yeshua Haben. Some say it's the pigeon Haben. The first one is Shavua Haben. The week of the sun is Bris Milah. Yeshua Haben is another word for a pigeon Haben. Really, we shouldn't get married, shouldn't have children, forget the whole thing, and we should just peter out. But he says, the last line, but what can we do? Better to leave the Jewish people, and they should sin unwittingly rather than intentionally. And that's really the end of the Gemara. It's a very, very strange ending. What was that? Exactly, very strange ending. So what is the Gemara coming to here? So the first piece is basically saying, okay, we've got to find a balance, because otherwise people won't live. The balance is going to be, the principle is going to be that basically when you have a special moments of simcha, like a new house or a chasna or whatever, you're going to do something to remember Yerushalayim. That's the basic principle, right? But then the Gemara finishes off with something which I think is designed to highlight the unanswerable paradox in this whole thing. And that is, we don't really have an answer to the question at the top. If you look at the way that this piece is structured carefully, the visceral response, from the kishkas of these people who had experienced this immense tragedy, was the correct response. We can't carry on. That is the human response. That's what we saw, after Holocaust. The same thing. The natural response is we actually logically we can't continue. Right? Logically we can't continue, but we have no choice. We have to continue. Therefore, we have to find some way through it. And at the end, I think he's really emphasizing that. The Gemara is really emphasizing this in a very powerful way. And it's saying that actually, we shouldn't really be able to continue. The Jewish people should just peter out because the suffering is too great to bear. But it's better that we should even though we know the right thing to do is to impose those decrees, technically the right thing to do is to impose these extreme decrees that basically would not allow us to survive anymore, because that's the only real way to justifiably, express the depth of our distress and mourning. But in reality, we can't do that because people wouldn't be able to do it. They wouldn't do it. Human beings are human beings, and therefore we basically have to say to people, look, better you carry on and do things quote unquote unwittingly rather than in a willful sinning way, if you like. So it is a very strange ending, and I think that the point about this ending is that it is unanswerable. Ultimately, the paradox of the problem of finding expression in mourning when you're dealing with something which is so painful is really an impossibility. It's an impossibility in terms of expressing, in terms of finding a way of expressing that. If that makes sense. And I don't know whether that, I sense that's reflected as well in like more modern, more recent tragedies that we've experienced as well. Whatever words we try and put things in, they will never suffice, okay? And I wanted to show you an example of that based on a very fascinating discussion that went on in already started in the 1940s about whether or not there should be established a day of Yom HaShoah, right? We know that it was established, Yom HaShoah as we know it today, but you might be aware there was a very big controversy over its establishment and whether or not it should be established. And this is not about commenting on that, right? It's more about what we can learn from the debate itself. So the debate centered around, and this began already even as early as I think 1942, 1943. Rav Herzog, who was the chief rabbi at the time, then it was obviously not yet the state of Israel, it was then mandatory Palestine. So Rav Herzog went to see Rav Soloveitchik, the Briskerov, not Soloveitchik from America, but who was known as Ravel Soloveitchik, the Briskerov, who was living in Yerushalayim. And this was in the early 1942, I think, or around about that time. And this was when they had become aware of that was the first time they became aware of the scale of the devastation in Europe by that around about that year. I mean, they didn't know how bad it was, but they had heard, right? And there was fast days. They fasted, and the Jews living in Israel fasted, and they davened, the institutional, this is what went on. And he went to see Rav Soloveitchik to try and ask him, and said, look, effectively saying, when all this is over, they didn't know when they needed to institute a new national day, a national fast, for the Jewish people, right? Day of fasting, day of mourning, because of the magnitude of the devastation. But the Briskerov disagreed and said no. And he said the reason why he opposed the institution of a separate day was based on a kinnah that we say on Tisha B'Av morning called Miyatein Rosh Hashanah. Miyatein Rosh Hashanah is a kinnah which deals with the Crusades. Right? It's a kinnah that was written about the destruction of the killers of Shum. That's what it says. Kinnah shenichva lechorban kilos Shum b'gzeres tov nun vov. So in the 11th century, and the Shum is an acronym for Shver, Vermeiser, which was worms, and mites. They were called the kilos Shum because they were very, very famous, established kehillas. And this is one of the most famous kinnas that we say on Tisha B'Av morning. I'm actually thinking, just as an aside, because I'll be doing hopefully kind of explanatory. Idea is to do explanatory kinnas here, but I think I'll probably have a Zoom link because I know obviously not everyone can come to Shiur on Tisha B'Av morning for various reasons. So maybe I should do that as well. It will allow participation, particularly of ladies. This occurred to me that might be a nice thing to do. People can listen to bits and pieces if they want. But anyway, he says in this kinnah as follows: Simunu alvavchem mispeid ma'ala koshra. It's very poetic language. It's a very long kinnah. It's a very small piece of it. And he talks about the mourning for the devastation of the Crusades, the horrific suffering. These kehillas were devastated by them. Ki shekula harigosom lehisabel lehisafra. The killing that we have suffered is equal in terms of its mourning, and lehisafra is like sort of wallowing in the dust. The root there is afar. Kisreifas beis Elokeinu ha'olam v'habira, like the burning of the Beis Hamikdash itself. But he then says like this: but we can't add on another day, another appointed time. Moed means festival, of course, doesn't really mean festival. A festival Tisha B'Av is also called the Moed. It means a designated time, but it means we can't add on another date. We can't bring it early, only to bring it late. That's to do with, I think, the fact that we push off fast. We don't bring them sooner. And he goes on to say, let's skip the next line. Well, he basically says, Tachas kin hayom liv yossi ha'ora. I think liv yossi, I'm not sure exactly what liv yossi means in this context. But basically what he's saying is that instead it's this day that I arouse my mourning for later tragedies that we've suffered. And I will mourn, I will wail, I will weep with a bitter soul. And my mourning will be heavy from morning to evening. On the house of Yisrael and the people of Hashem who have fallen by the sword. So Rav Soloveitchik turned around to Rav Herzog and said, this kinnah tells us that we don't add in a new day of mourning. Why not? Because philosophically almost, we understand that every subsequent suffering is part of the suffering of Tisha B'Av. That Tisha B'Av is not just one event. It's not just one day. It's not even the events that are specifically mentioned that we know where Tisha B'Av was established for. It includes within it every further future suffering that we've experienced in Golos.
Is that why the Holocaust is very associated with Tisha B'Av?
Absolutely, 100%. Because of this, precisely. And even though there was a disagreement on this, right? Because Yom HaShoah was established, and there were many, leading figures like Rav Herzog who supported that and wanted that, felt it was necessary to do that, right?
It wasn't a fast thing.
No. Look, the Yom HaShoah was complicated for lots of reasons. It was the positioning of where it was. It was the fact that it was in during the month of Nisan. There were a number of, the fact that it was primarily established to do with the proximity towards the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which also not everyone was so comfortable with, not because that wasn't an amazing and heroic event, but just because, when you think of the vast majority of the events that happened in the Holocaust, should they all be sort of pushed into that? Originally it was known as Yom HaShoah v'Hagevura, the day of the Shoah and might, which was the connotation of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So there were a number of issues who weren't entirely comfortable. Interesting enough, originally the chief rabbin of Israel, I think in the 50s, wanted Asara B'Teves to be the day of national. They called it the Yom HaKadosh HaKlali, I think, like it would be the day of Kaddish. But it didn't really, many killers don't think it actually took off in that way. But Menachem Begin was very supportive of Tisha B'Av being established as the Holocaust Memorial Day, apparently. And I think he was even going to promote it in the Knesset. I don't think it happened in the end, but there was look, these things were discussed at obviously at great length. But the point here is that Tisha B'Av is much broader than these specific events. It includes within it, and that's what we say during the Kinnos, we include within it everything else that transpired. I mean, the next source explains this more, because this is a tshuva responsive of Rav Moshe. Moshe Feinstein, basically says that the title is where it says the second bold line. He says, "B'tam shelo tiknu yom kavua l'tanis v'tefillah l'zecha harugei HaShoah." Why did they not institute a day for fasting and tefillah to remember those who were murdered in the Shoah? What was the reason? That was his question. And he says, and he goes through and basically says, why is it that this hasn't been established as a separate day? And he brings the fact that that we mentioned specifically the fact that we didn't there wasn't another day instituted for example, the suffering at the time of the Crusades, even though they applied, across many parts of Europe. And the answer is because it's all included, the same idea. It's all included within Tisha B'Av. Now he says, just turn over to the next page, so that we don't have to do all of this. He basically says that a devastation of the nature of Hitler, he says, Gezeres to Hitler, to Hoyo al Klal Yisrael, the second line on the next page, to Hoyo Holech, I think, he went and conquered places that were the primary place where the Jewish people lived. He killed everyone who was there. And he wanted to conquer the whole world. And he couldn't stand against him until Hashem had mercy. It's a decree against the whole of the Jewish people. And therefore, it's connected to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, through which we are found to be in Golus, in exile. We don't have another day of mourning, as we say in the Kiddush themselves. In other words, he makes a distinction between certain events in our history. He talks about the Chalmoniki massacres, because they were known as Gezeres Tach V'Tat, because of the years when they transpired. In those days, they did institute a special day for fasting and saying slichas. I think it's Chav Sivan. Tach V'Tat. Tov. Well, we are now Tov Shin. So it's like 300 and something years ago. Tov Shin. We're now Tov Shin. Nearly 400 years ago. If you work it out, that was Tov Ches, and we're now Tov Shin Pei Aleph. So the Shin is kind of 380. We're kind of 380 years on from there. About it was 1600 and something, I think. Anyway, they were horrific massacres, and there was a day of fasting instituted. And there are some people who still say slichas to this time. I think it's Chof Sivan, if I'm not mistaken, 20th of December. Anyway, the point he's making is that was specific to a particular community. It was a particular place, whereas something that affected the whole world, the whole of the Jewish world, or the known Jewish world, whatever, that's something which is automatically part of Tisha B'Av. Okay, it's automatically part of Tisha B'Av. So that means that when we talk about Tisha B'Av, we mean to try and find a perspective and meaning, not just in the events that are recorded as having taken place on Tisha B'Av, like the destruction of the two Botei Mikdash and other events that took place on that day, but actually a perspective on mourning in general for all the tragedies that we have suffered. That's the idea. That's the idea. And the question, therefore, is what is that perspective? So just a couple of sources here, which I think are helpful. Sefer HaTodah is Rabbi Lior Kitov, very well-known. People have the Sefer in English. It's very useful insightful work on the cycle of the Jewish year. And he says he brings a famous story of Napoleon. Napoleon Kaiser Tzarfat, right? Shepam Achas over al Pesach Beis HaKnesses Paris B'Yom Tisha B'Av. And the story was that he was once passing an entrance of a shul in Paris on Tisha B'Av. You've heard the story? There were Jews who were sitting on the ground. And they were mourning the Beis HaMikdash, the land of Eretz Yisrael, right? As if their tragedy had happened yesterday. He was astonished. And after that he said, Nishba, he says, I make an oath, there will be a good future for this people in their land. He said, where do you ever find any other people in the world that they are able to hold on to their mourning and their hope for 2,000 years, and it will never be lost from them? So there's one lovely story of Napoleon basically finding it astonishing that the Jews can still mourn over something 2,000 years later. If it's so deeply ingrained within you, then it must be something that will lead to some form of hope at the end. The point of the story is brought out more clearly, I think, from in the sources that follow, that there is when we look for meaning in Tisha B'Av, the meaning on a very basic level, sometimes it's very good to be basic rather than too complicated, is from the day itself, from the way the fact that we have the day and the restrictions that we have on it and everything else, that itself is a form of inspiration. Yeah? And Sifsei Chaim Friedlander says, to source 5, he says, just like we draw, strength, encouragement, idud is like encouragement from the miracles of the exile, right? Right? There is also in the fact of the pain and the mourning of the destruction, midei shana b'shana, each year, that itself is edus ne'emona. That is a faithful testimony ala kiyam haruchani sha'am Yisrael, on the spiritual survival of Klal Yisrael. Sha'ilem atzinu am beinu amen, because there is no other people amongst any other nations of the world. She'etzayin yom zikaron lezecha mapalusov. No one else institutes a day, right? A day to remember its downfalls, its bad times. It's just unheard of. You don't have a day in the national calendar where you remember, it's like saying you'd always have a day remembering that England nearly won and failed. You're not going to institute a day, right, on the basis of a failure. And yet we have this whole period in our history, in our year, more than one period in the year really, but this is obviously the primary focus, where the day is instituted on how bad things were, how things were devastating. He says, on the contrary, they only have the days of victory. And the Jewish people mark the day of destruction each year. That's that day of tragedy each year, day of devastation. And he's basically pointing out that itself is a proof, is testimony on the spiritual survival of the Jewish people. Because if we're so confident that we can institute a day that describes the terrible things that occurred to us, it must be we have strength and hope on our survival in the future as well, similar to that story with Napoleon. That's the idea that is being presented. Now, yeah, does that make sense? Any questions on that? Or yeah? So I brought this English quote from Rabbi Emanuel Feldman's lovely book. Have you seen the book, The Shul Without a Clock? He wrote it a long, long time ago. It's really worthy. It's just a lovely, lovely book. Maybe I'm a bit biased because it's very especially nice for rabbis to read. Because basically it's about his reflections on being a community rabbi for many, many years. It's called The Shul Without a Clock because he was a rabbi in Atlanta, Georgia. Now he lives in Israel. But he's quite an elderly man now, I think. But he called it The Shul Without a Clock because of, the joke that kind of like that's the most important thing in the shul is the clock. Everyone looks at the clock, and he's from the position of the rabbi. That's quite an interesting perspective. But he says, he says like this. He says that Tisha B'Av is his favorite day, not because it's enjoyable, but because of what it represents. It says to me about Jews that we are a people who remember and know its past leads to the future. There are more Italians in the world than Jews, but no one laments for Rome. There are more Greeks than Jews. The Acropolis, the Parthenon, tourist attractions, but no one mourns because of their destruction. And he goes on in the same vein. Look at the next page. He says, I like Tisha B'Av because only a people that can weep will someday learn to laugh. And this is something which I think is just as profound. He says, I like Tisha B'Av because I need it. In the midst of all the affluence and the creature comforts, he says, I need to remove my leather shoes. I need to dim the lights. I need to fast and indulge myself. I need to read Lamentations. I need to weep for its bloody history of our people. I need to focus outward. I need to Tisha B'Av because it reminds me of what it is to be a Jew. All the problems that we suffer, that the empires of the world abhor the Jew because he belongs to a nation that dwells alone. As part of the conference that I was at today, there was a report from the CST, Mark Gardner, the CST, and it was an incredibly sobering listen to hear him. That one of 11 days of fighting, and they recorded during that month the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents they've ever recorded, right, in this country. And incredibly, really horrific stuff. We all know about that convoy but really, it's there, it's present. Yeah, he said it doesn't make any sense. There is no way that you can attribute all of that to Israel, to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. He said it doesn't make any sense, because it's so deeply ingrained that the anti-Semitic tropes and everything else. He says, I like Tisha B'Av because it teaches something profound, that for Judaism, historical events are not just history, not just events. Judaism, an event occurs, it goes on being part of us. It's a cognition, it's an ongoing perception, a new consciousness. And because also, he says, has a message of hope and faith. This day, Mashiach was born. That is how it is. The day of destruction, the redemption begins. So this is the positive perspective, if you like, on Tisha B'Av itself, right? Now, the question is, how does that relate back to how we started? So we began with the Gemara. It talks about how the Beis Hamikdash was, how when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there effectively was this, internal debate. How do we mark it, right? How do we mark it? We go to the extreme of basically doing nothing, banning everything because we can't cope with the immensity of the tragedy. But then people won't survive and they won't even listen. They won't be able to do it. So we find this middle of the road approach, even though we know that really it's not sufficient. It doesn't work. So what I think that tells you is that ultimately all the restrictions, and although the discussion there is more about the ongoing things the rest of the year, but it tells you something also about the aim of all the restrictions of the rest of this time of year, the 3 weeks and the 9 days, and then Tisha B'Av and everything else, right? In that way, that the main essence of what we're trying to achieve here is to somehow affect us internally, to lead us to think and reflect on the key messages of the day. That's really what it's all about. And there is a fascinating parallel to the very beginning in this of how Tisha B'Av actually starts. Where's the origins of Tisha B'Av? The origins of Tisha B'Av is the night with the spies, right? The Meraglim, yeah? The story of the spies. The Meraglim come back and they weep on that night. And Hashem says, because you wept on that night, that's actually the last 2 lines here, that They wept on that night, the last lines on the sheet. It was the night of Tisha B'Av. Hashem said to them, you have wept for nothing. So I'm going to fix for you weeping for generations because you wept for no purpose on that night. It's an interesting question on that whole thing, because in what way was it weeping for nothing? I mean, they had a reason to weep, but maybe we can explain that a little bit from the one of the key psukim here. So look at the 2 lines before that. What did the spies do? So they basically produced this negative report about the land. The land which we've crossed through to survey it, they say it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. They talked about the giants, everything. We saw these giants there. We see that this is all recounted again in this week's parasha, Devarim. It's all recounted again. Basically, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. It's a dangerous place. There are giants there. What is the key point that they do with the Meraglim? So Shimon Schwab says that everything about what they say is based on the externals. It's based on what they see. They jump to conclusions. That's the biggest problem Meraglim do. The Meraglim are sent to give a report. They're not sent to give an opinion. That's the fundamental problem there, right? They're sent to report back facts, but they don't. They say facts, and they say our interpretation of these facts is that we will never manage, right? And that's where they fall. That's where they're wrong. Yeah, and that's where everything goes wrong. But that point of them making a decision on the basis of what they've of saying we're not going to cope is based on looking at a situation, seeing a situation as it looks, the external appearance, and jumping to conclusions. That's what happens. And had they not done that, then everything would have been different. Okay, it's the same idea. When they say, that we appeared in their eyes as grasshoppers, right? We were like grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. And famously, the Mefarshim asked, how on earth did they know what they were thinking about you? The answer was because that was their perception. They perceived themselves as nothing, and therefore they came to this conclusion as they couldn't cope, they couldn't manage to do. So I think you can draw a comparison that this is the opposite side of the coin of what we're trying to achieve on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av begins through people only looking at the external and saying we have reached a conclusion based on what we can see, and we're not interested in the depth at all. We're not going any further than what we just see on the surface. And that leads to disaster. On Tisha B'Av, we take a day and we have a series of restrictions, which in and of themselves might feel like we are either going through the motions, or, as that Gemara we started with says, are trying to achieve the impossibility. Like you're never going to be able, whatever you're going to do is never going to come close to what you should do, right? To somehow put voice to the unvoiceable, right? To be able to mourn for something which you can never mourn for enough, right? But what you can do is learn from the points you do put into practice, that what we do, the way we keep Tisha B'Av can affect and should affect the way we reflect on the time, the internals. Instead of just focusing on the externals, what we do on Tisha B'Av is designed to affect how we look at things on the inside, how we look at our position in the world, how we look at the concept of the suffering we have undergone and take strength and heart from it, so that it shouldn't be only a day, right? That's the meaning in the morning. It shouldn't be just a day of going through the motions. It should be a day where we find meaning in the morning. And how do we find that meaning? So I think we find that meaning, I think a very powerful way of finding that meaning is in the morning itself. It's in the fact that we still mourn. By still mourning, we are proving, right, that we always have hope, and we believe that it will come to pass, that the future will come, that Mashiach will come. We will once again see a future that doesn't contain these aspects of mourning and tragedy. The power is the fact that it still exists, and the fact that we still have the day, and the fact that we can still have the hope for a future and a better and a brighter future, that I think gives us the strength. So I hope that's just some ideas. I don't know whether anyone has any questions. Very happy if you want to ask anything, anyone on Zoom, since there's a greater contingent on Zoom. No worry if not, but if anyone does want to ask anything, happy to.
Oh, thank you very much, Rabbi.
Okay, good, fine, pleasure. Thank you for joining. Fast well. All right.
Thank you very much.
Fine. Okay, that's fine. Pleasure. That's fine. Have a good evening. Okay.
Can I ask, are you